Most people, when they think about the plagues of medieval Europe, picture the obvious: the Black Death, smallpox, waves of famine sweeping through villages. But buried in the historical records of the early 16th century is something that doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories. For centuries, an unexplained phenomenon gripped parts of the continent. Ordinary people, farmers, merchants, mothers, would begin to dance without warning, without music, and without the ability to stop. What started as hours stretched into days. Their bodies gave out long before the compulsion did, and many collapsed where they stood, overcome by total exhaustion. It sounds invented, like a piece of folklore someone exaggerated over centuries of retelling. But this is not legend. It is one of the most thoroughly documented medical anomalies in European history. The single most extreme case unfolded in one city across one summer in 1518. For 500 years, no one could adequately explain what happened. Theories ranged from demonic possession to mass hysteria to divine punishment. None of them held up. But when modern researchers finally revisited the evidence with tools the medieval world never had, what they uncovered was stranger than any curse. And it had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. To understand what science eventually uncovered, we need to start with the event itself. The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg was oppressively hot. The city, a wealthy trading hub within the Holy Roman Empire, was already under strain. Years of poor harvests and regional unrest had left the population on edge. Food was scarce. Tensions were high. It was against this backdrop that, on a July afternoon, a woman recorded in the chronicles as Frau Trophäa stepped out of her home onto a narrow cobblestone street and began to dance. There was no music, no crowd, no occasion. She moved as though responding to a rhythm only she could hear, twisting, stepping, swaying in an unbroken involuntary loop. Her husband watched, confused and alarmed, and begged her to come inside. She did not stop. By all accounts, she was unable to. Trophäa continued through the rest of the day, through the evening, and into the darkness. Exhaustion eventually forced her to the ground, but the next morning she rose and started again. This cycle repeated for 4 to 6 days without interruption. Her body was visibly worn, her movements heavy and labored, yet whatever was driving her would not relent. Within a week, more than 30 other people in Strasbourg had begun doing the same thing. The dancing was spreading. The city's physicians examined the situation and arrived at a diagnosis rooted in the medical thinking of their era. The dancer's blood had become overheated. According to humoral theory, the dominant medical framework of the 16th century, the body was governed by 4 fluids, and illness resulted from imbalance. The logical treatment, by their reasoning, was to let the afflicted keep moving until the excess heat burned itself out. The Strasbourg City Council acted on this advice with remarkable commitment. They emptied guild halls and converted an open-air grain market into a designated dancing space. They constructed a large wooden stage beside the horse fair. And then, in what must rank among history's most spectacularly misguided public health decisions, they hired musicians. Professional pipers and drummers were paid to play day and night, providing a soundtrack to the growing crowd of involuntary dancers, as though transforming a medical crisis into an officially endorsed public event would somehow resolve it. It did the opposite. The music drew more people in. By the end of the month, the number of dancers had reportedly reached 400. Crowds gathered to watch, and some of those spectators found themselves pulled into the same uncontrollable movement. The chronicles from this period describe the afflicted as utterly spent, drenched in sweat, staring ahead with blank, unfocused expressions, moving as though their conscious minds had simply switched off while their legs kept going. People were dropping to the ground daily, overwhelmed by exhaustion, unable to sustain what their bodies were being compelled to do. By August, the authorities accepted that their approach had not only failed, it had made things worse. The council dismantled the stages, sent the musicians home, and issued a formal decree prohibiting all public music and dancing within the city for the rest of the summer. Having exhausted the medical options available to them, they turned to the church. The explanation shifted from biology to theology. The public consensus settled on a specific culprit, Saint Vitus, a 4th century Sicilian martyr who, in medieval folk belief, was said to possess the power to afflict sinners with compulsive dancing. If he had sent the curse, only he could lift it. The dancers who were in the worst condition were placed in wagons and transported on a 3-day journey to a mountaintop shrine dedicated to St. Vitus near the town of Saverne. There, in a dim grotto heavy with incense and the low murmur of Latin prayers, priests performed an elaborate ritual. They stood the dancers before a carved wooden figure of the saint, placed small crosses in their hands, and fitted them with red shoes, the soles and uppers marked with crosses drawn in consecrated oil and sprinkled with holy water. And gradually, the dancing stopped. Word reached Strasbourg that those taken to the shrine had recovered. More wagons were dispatched. Over the following weeks, the flow of affected citizens tapered off. By early September, the outbreak was over. It had lasted approximately 2 months. What makes Strasbourg's outbreak so extraordinary isn't just the event itself, it's how thoroughly it was recorded. Physician observations, church sermons, city council minutes, and at least 6 independent chronicle accounts survive. The physician alchemist Paracelsus traveled to Strasbourg 8 years after the event to conduct his own investigation. But the 1518 case was not an isolated incident. Comparable outbreaks had occurred across Central Europe for hundreds of years. The most significant prior episode struck Aachen in 1374, when thousands joined a frenzied public dance that spread along the Rhine to Cologne, Metz, and Utrecht. Historians have identified more than 20 such events between the 7th and 17th centuries, nearly all of them clustered along the Rhine corridor. After 1518, the phenomenon disappeared entirely. No major outbreak was ever recorded again. For centuries, no theory could adequately explain why. The list of proposed explanations is long: epilepsy, encephalitis, typhus. In the 1980s, mass psychogenic illness gained traction. The idea that shared psychological stress, amplified by deeply held superstitions, could tip large groups into a collective altered state. Stress was certainly present in 16th century Strasbourg, but none of these theories could account for the specific physical symptoms the chronicles describe: the prolonged, involuntary motion, the altered consciousness, the complete disconnection from the surrounding environment. One theory, however, matched the evidence in a way the others never did. In the mid-20th century, Swedish pharmacologist Eugene Louis Backman proposed that the real cause was ergot, a parasitic fungus that colonizes damp rye grain. In 16th century Strasbourg, rye bread wasn't a luxury or an option. It was the primary caloric source for the working population. Every household depended on it, and when ergot infiltrated the grain supply, it introduced a set of naturally occurring compounds that are chemically related to lysergic acid, the precursor molecule to LSD. When people ate bread made from contaminated rye, the effects were profound. The compounds interfered directly with the nervous system, producing mental disorientation, agitation, distorted perception, and, most relevantly, an involuntary physical restlessness that manifested as relentless, repetitive movement. The people affected were not choosing to dance. Their nervous systems were being chemically overridden. They moved because the compounds in their food would not let them be still. The environmental conditions leading up to 1518 fit this scenario precisely. The region had experienced years of severe flooding. Ergot thrives in exactly these conditions: damp soil, wet harvests, humid storage. The rye that Strasbourg's population was grinding into flour and baking into bread had likely been sitting in poorly ventilated granaries through months of moisture. By midsummer, the contamination would have been widespread, and the population, already desperate from years of scarcity, was in no position to discard grain that looked even slightly off. The timeline reinforces this further. The outbreak began in mid-July, precisely when bread baked from the previous year's stored harvest would still have been the city's primary food source. And the symptoms recorded in the chronicles align almost exactly with what modern pharmacology would predict from ergot exposure: the relentless physical movement, the profuse sweating, the vacant, distant expressions, the sudden, inexplicable shifts in mood. Some individuals reportedly laughing without any apparent cause. These are not the characteristics of spiritual panic or collective stress. They are the recognizable signatures of a potent psychoactive compound, acting on the central nervous system of an entire community. The geographic evidence adds another layer. Virtually every documented outbreak of dancing mania occurred along the Rhine and Mosel River valleys, among the most flood-prone agricultural zones in Europe. These were rye-dependent communities. In difficult years, the choice was between eating questionable grain and starving. They ate it. Historians continue to discuss the finer details: how many people were involved, the exact sequence of events, whether the more dramatic claims in later chronicles were exaggerated. But the scientific explanation for what drove the dancing has, for most researchers, settled clearly on ergot. The dancing plague of 1518 consumed Strasbourg for 2 months and then vanished, leaving behind half a dozen chronicles, a handful of engravings, and 5 centuries of confusion. We always knew these people danced. What we didn't know, until modern pharmacology caught up, was why. It was not a curse. It was not hysteria. It was not the wrath of a long-dead saint. It was a fungus growing quietly on damp grain baked into the bread that an entire city ate. And the mystery, after 500 years, was finally solved at the kitchen table.